Good morning. Today it is my honor to introduce Paul Greenwood. He is the Deputy District Attorney here at the San Diego Attorney's Office, and he has been the lead prosecutor for elder abuse for over 20 years now. So we have a lot to talk about today, Paul.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Paul, thank you for joining us today. And before we get into the questions, we want to talk about Moom.
Yes.
How is that, am I saying? How's she doing? And tell us about that story in a little bit.
Yeah, well, a lot of the reason why I've been doing this kind of work for over 20 years is because of my parents. And sadly, I lost my dad, who was 92, about 20 months ago to advanced Alzheimer's, leaving my mother as a widow, who's still amazing me every day at age 93. She lives alone in the town that I grew up in south of England. But the one thing I pledged to her several years ago when Dad eventually moved into a nursing home was that I would stay in touch with her every single day, wherever possible. So at first, Ron, I would phone her every day from here back to England. But for the last 18 months, thanks to the wonders of technology with iPads, and I purchased her a mini iPad. For the last 18 months, I've been FaceTiming my mother every single morning.
Awesome. Isn't that fabulous?
And I really try to endorse that wherever I go and encourage people of my age with an elderly parent living away from them to stay in touch as frequently as they can. Because as you know, you hear so many stories of people being ripped off, but one of the reasons why they do get ripped off is because their own children have abandoned their responsibility. You know?
They live in isolation.
They do.
In isolation.
And the predators seem to know exactly, instinctively, who to target when they suspect that somebody is living in an isolated bubble and they can move in on that person.
Well, let's talk about the news of October 2016, where you announced a big arrest of some scammers. Tell us about that and how that came about.
Yes, the DA's office had our own October surprise. Yeah, it was good. And it's something that we had to keep under wraps for a long time. How this all came to us was that a former colleague of mine, a former prosecutor, Jim Baker, came to me about 2 years ago, very upset. I could tell something was wrong, and he said, I've just discovered that my mother, of all people, who was 86 at the time, has become the victim of the grandma scam. And I mean, we've heard of that, how the crooks portray themselves as the grandson. I'm in jail, and in this instance, he portrayed himself as being in jail in Peru, and she believed it, and then they worked the scam to the point where she ended up driving all around the county of San Diego, something which she never would have done otherwise, purchasing what we call Green Dot prepaid cards to the tune of $65,000, believing that this was going to help her grandson get out of jail, get out of Peru, and get back to his Coast Guard officer job on the East Coast of America. So when Jim, my friend, found out about it, he was not only just shocked that his mother could fall for it, but also determined to do something about it. So he came to me, I got my office to agree that we should investigate it. And thanks to the amazing work of one of our investigators, he systematically, for about 15 months, tracked all the money, but in doing so, uncovered a labyrinth of a worldwide network of crooks who were doing all this scamming, whether it be the grandma scam, the IRS scam, the jury duty scam, and ultimately it all pointed back to a boiler room in India. So what happened 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Houston announced this indictment of all these suspects, including our suspect from Riverside County, as one of 52 people. And when they did their press conference, I went to Bonnie Dimonetiadi and I said, I really think we should do our own press conference just to educate the folks here in San Diego that it can happen to us, but also to give kudos to our own investigator for doing a tireless work for so many months.
Well, congratulations, and hopefully it puts a dent.
A little dent.
We hope so, yes, because that suspect was arrested in Riverside and is now being transported back to Houston, where he will face charges with all the others. And because it's federal, because it crosses state and national lines, the exposure is far greater than what we could have done for him.
Well, congratulations on
That's
pursuing.
awesome.
Thank you.
So there are a number of scams, as you mentioned a few.
Yes.
Do these scams all have something in common that people can watch for or listen for? Or?
They do, and primarily it's the weapon of choice is the phone, the telephone, and the trademark is something's going to happen to you or to your family member if you don't do what we need you to do, which is pay money. And it's always somebody pretending to be either a family member or someone in a position of authority, as a sergeant from the sheriff's department or the jury commissioner or the IRS, claiming that you're going to be arrested. And the common denominator is they send out all these phone calls to thousands and thousands of people every day. And of course, many of those fall upon an elderly person living alone at home. And this phone call comes as a bolt out of the blue, and they panic. And they don't turn to anybody, because another denominator is that the crooks will often tell them, don't tell anybody, this has to be done quickly, it has to be done in secret, because otherwise something bad can happen to either you or your family member. So without thinking, they are paralyzed into fear. And the other common denominator is the type of transfer of how the money gets from the victim to the suspects. It's typically either through a Green Dot prepaid debit card, which you can purchase at Walmart or
And
CVS.
you can't really trace, right?
Which you can't trace. Or now, because the crooks realize that we're onto them with the Green Dot cards, they're asking people to go and purchase iTunes, Apple cards of all things.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because you scratch that off the back and they have 14 digits. And as long as you pass those 14 digits on, that can be downloaded anywhere in the world.
Oh, my gosh.
And then those crooks use those to purchase iPads or whatever it is and then sell them on the open market.
And I just want you to stress that this doesn't have to be a senior with limited capacity or anything like that. It could be anybody.
Well, that's precisely right. You know, because I think our profile is, oh, it's somebody with advanced dementia. No, we've had professionals. I mean, Jim Baker's own mother, the one I talked about at the beginning of this interview, very smart lady, a retired teacher, and she had all her wits about her. The one thing was she loves her grandson dearly. And that's what these predators thrive upon, is that emotional attachment, telling you that unless you do something, your grandson is going to be in danger. And once you hear that, logic disappears, you know.
So what is the lessons that we can learn from this? And I know you have something called the top 10 tips. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, looking at it from the perspective of a child, an adult son or daughter, if you have an elderly parent living alone, that in itself is a red flag, because we've got to wake up and realize that our elderly parent is today a sitting target. And that's why I stay in touch with my mother every single day, because of what I've learned over 20 years is that there are people out there who will wake up this morning and go, how can I rip off Mrs. Greenwood? You know, I mean, that's exactly what's going on. So we've built up these top 10 tips, and many of them are designed to make not just the adult children aware, but also the elderly people aware. And I'm not trying to make people paranoid, but I'm simply trying to raise the awareness out there that unfortunately the days when a handshake was good enough, when the warm, nice, emotional, kind, welcoming voice on the telephone was a nice thing to have happen to you, no, those days are gone. And unfortunately, we have to teach ourselves to be skeptical about everyone and everything that either phones us, sends us a letter, or knocks on the door. And those top 10 tips are based around that kind of attitude.
Scary.
Scary. I mean, for example, many of us, we may be faced with choosing a caregiver, right, at some point for a loved one. Well, you just don't go to Craigslist anymore. You don't go to the ads in the newspaper anymore. You have to go through a bonded insured agency. And even though people tell me, but Mr. Greenwood, those cost more. Yeah, but you know what? You get what you pay for. And if you don't do that, then the chances are you're opening up to hiring a convicted felon. Yeah.
And or even putting yourself at risk by not having the appropriate insurance for those people to be on the property. And
see, that's
workman's comp. I mean, the whole laundry
exactly
list.
Right.
It just explodes.
It explodes. You're so right. And these crooks, for example, unlicensed contractors, if we hire somebody who's not licensed and then they trip and fall and they don't have workers' comp, they may turn around and sue you for allowing them onto your property. So.
Yep. So if someone in my family or a dear friend my mother-in-law's gotten the calls. Fortunately, she's been a little tricky herself in that she's gotten the grandma call, I'm in jail. and she'll say, "Who is this?" And the other end of the phone said, "Well, it's your grandson." And she said, "Well, which one?"
Good.
And then he hung up on her.
Of course. Yes.
Because she's not on Facebook, so we couldn't get a name from Facebook for her.
Excellent.
But I'm sure there are a lot of grandparents who are on Facebook to keep up with their grandkids,
Oh.
and so that information is pretty easily
It's leaked.
accessible.
It's so
and
true.
so someone could call and say, it's your grandson Joe, and then it becomes much more believable. So what advice would you give to someone, like you said, who's so vulnerable, especially a grandmother to a grandchild?
Right, right. I just want to reassure people that, for example, the IRS, police, jails, they don't operate by phoning you and saying, hey, you need to send money. We just don't do it that way, thankfully, in the United States of America. It doesn't work that way. Only crooks work that way. So if you do get a call, be very skeptical anyway. And I always tell people, use caller ID, use your message machine. Don't automatically pick up the phone and answer it unless you know who's calling you. And if you don't recognize the number, why don't you let it go to message? Because if it is urgent, if it is important, they'll leave a message for you. And then, of course, if they leave a message which sounds a little suspicious, then do your due diligence and check with your neighbor, with your family, with somebody else that you trust, and say, look, I've had this call, what do you think? And 9 times out of 10, it's bogus, and you should leave it alone.
Well, and if you have a message on your machine, is that something that's even more traceable?
Yes, I mean, that's always good, because I'm always willing to receive those messages from the public, because then I get the phone numbers, I record them, and then and sometimes on a quiet morning, I will make that call myself, because I want to educate myself by talking to these crooks. And I've talked to so many of these crooks on the phone. I've recorded their messages as well, because I want to learn what script they use, what methods they use. And so I let them take me down the path to see how far they go with it before I drop the brick on them by saying, oh, by the way, this is the San Diego DA's office. Yeah.
Well, being in the holiday season as we are, is there a spike in any particular scam? I mean, the IRS is more only a March and April scam, I assume.
Right.
Is there a spike of any type of scam that we can advise them on in November, December?
Not really. These phone calls and these scams occur all year round. But what does happen more often in the holiday season is, unfortunately, your personal safety is compromised with identity theft. We're all very distracted, aren't we, in the holiday season? And one thing I'm constantly telling elderly, particularly female consumers, is when you go out shopping and you're going and you're thinking 100 miles an hour of what I need to buy, you get distracted very quickly. The predators are out there looking for your purse, sitting in the top part of that cart. And they will distract you very quickly, and they work in pairs, and they'll unzip your purse and remove your wallet. And by the time you get to the checkout lane and realize your wallet's missing,
It's too late.
it's too late. They've long gone. And you know what? They've already gone to the gas station to fill up with gas. They're so quick with these things. So that's what I always tell people at holiday season: be much more aware of your surroundings and of your personal belongings, and try not to get too distracted, because the predators are going to be out there in the shopping malls.
What relationship should the consumer have, the elderly and the adult child have with the bank and the credit unions today?
Great point, Ron. And number one, I really urge these financial institutions to take their responsibilities much more seriously about their obligations to the banks. Call them customers, right? And the credit unions call them members, because those financial institutions are indeed financially mandated reporters of suspected financial elder abuse. And some institutions, banks and credit unions, do a fabulous job of training their staff to look out. So, for example, victims of the grandma scam or the IRS scam who believe that they need to go to the bank or the credit union and withdraw $5,000 in cash. Now, I'm not being personal here, but when was the last time you and I withdrew $5,000 in cash from any financial institution? I can't think of a time when I ever have. And so any time that happens with an 85-year-old lady walking in asking for $5,000 in cash, or a man, that should immediately put the teller on an alert. And that needs training. So they need to then bring the customer or the member into a private office, sit them down, which is what happened in Jim Baker's mother's case, finally the bank sat her down and asked her, has anyone called you? Has anyone said your grandson is in jail? And then that's when it all came to light. We need more bank tellers, more credit union tellers to be taking that responsibility and doing that. So I think institutions need to realize what their responsibility is and to be on the lookout much more for irregularities in the banking of their older customers.
And Paul, you traveled the world getting this message out. What words of pearls of wisdom, words of wisdom can you want to convey to the audience today that hopefully can put another dent into this?
Be proactive is my key. If your gut tells you that either your mother or father or an elderly grandparent or a neighbor down the street is acting differently, there's a shift in their behavior, because that's what one thing Jim Baker on the grandma scam says to me, Paul, I should have realized my mother was covering up on something because her whole daily routine was changing. And she was covering up to explain why she wasn't home at a certain time of day or night, because she was driving all the way up to Fallbrook to purchase these Green Dot cards because the crooks were telling her go to different places. If you see a change in that person's behavior, let your gut tell you that's something wrong, and don't be afraid to call Adult Protective Services. We're going to have a number put up there. It's 1-800-510-2020. And unless you are a mandated reporter, you can remain anonymous. And nobody's going to criticize you for making that call. Nobody's going to say, why are you wasting our time? No, I would never say that. So that's my first thing. Go with your gut and be proactive. And secondly, for those adult sons and daughters out there, be more involved in your parents' lives. Stay in touch. Stay in touch if your parents will allow you to. And then thirdly, if you're an older adult, 65 or older, be street smart, be savvy, ask more questions, and don't always react immediately to a phone call, to a letter. Always check with a loved one, with a professional advisor. Check with somebody that you trust and who you respect before you ever commit to anything that's going to cost you money.
Thank you for that. And most important, where do you get to spend Christmas this year?
Well, we're going to be here in San Diego. And sadly, not with the grandkids. They were with us last year. But thankfully, our daughter and son-in-law who live in England have promised our twin granddaughters, when they turn 5 in February, then they'll come out hopefully for Easter or maybe in the summer. But we will be here. But I always go and try and make a visit to my mum straight after Christmas because my mum thankfully spends Christmas with my older sister, who's very, very good about making sure that Mum's not alone. And then I try to be there in the new year sometimes. So I'll spend a few days with my mum in early January.
Fantastic. Paul, thank you for being here today. I hope this message gets to everybody around the country because it's such an important issue and it's growing epidemically every day, as we know.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank you both because this is so important to get the word out there through the media. I can't spend my time going around to various places all the time. I need to be in court prosecuting the bad guys. So the message to get out there is so, so important. So thank you for allowing me this opportunity.
Our pleasure.
Thank
Our
you.
pleasure.
And stay tuned for more Senior Stay or Go TV.